Creativity is everything. Whether you're a small brand, a big brand, apply creativity to your product, apply it to your communication, you can apply it to your distribution.
Today's guest is one of the most accomplished creative minds in the industry. Sascha Kuntze is Chief Creative Officer at BBH Singapore, when he has led award-winning creative campaigns across beauty, gaming, tourism, and beyond. In this episode, he shares what it really takes to build a brand in 2025, why creativity is still your brand's sharpest tool, and the hard truths founders need to hear about what's working and what's not. Hi, Sascha. Welcome to the podcast. So great to have you here.
Hi.
Let's dive straight into it. You have worked on some of the world's most impactful campaigns. What does creativity mean to you?
Creativity is everything. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a creative in a creative agency. I think you can apply it to just everything. Whether you're a small brand, a big brand, you can apply creativity to your product. You can apply it to your communication. You can apply it to your distribution. Typically, I think we're just talking about creativity when it comes to communication. And I think that's the mistake a lot of brands do by not applying creativity everywhere. And if you're looking at modern, successful brands, new and up-and-coming brands, they apply creativity in the product. So you're seeing Loewe, for example, are not just looking at how they can creatively talk about their product or the influences they're using, et cetera, et cetera. They're actually creating products that aren't really meant to be bought. They're creating buzz, they're creating hype for the brand, they're creating community. And I think that's how they're applying creativity to the product. And you have other brands like Prime, and they're applying it to distribution by making it scarce and making it, creating hype that way. And so I think you can use creativity in so many ways. If you unlock it from just being a thing that you apply at the very end when you talk to consumers, then I think you found a recipe for success.
Yeah, so it's not about being creative and just the visuals and the ads, but the entire process, how you can make something a bit more interesting, a bit more unusual, then it can be something really special.
Correct, yeah.
So kind of sidetracking a little bit, you mentioned Loewe. Their creative director obviously was such a monumental force in taking Loewe from sort of like where they were to the brand that is now. And now that he's left for Dior, what do you think about that? And what do you think about the role of a creative director?
Yeah, it's what is interesting in a lot of fashion brands is that because the creative sits within the company, a lot of the success is driven that way. When you look at other brands, the creative sits outside. They're hiring agencies, etc. And then it really comes down to how well these two partners are communicating, how much trust there is in that relationship that then leads to success. So if you're having a creative within the company, you're very privileged. In the case of Loewe, we're very privileged to have had him. I don't know who's next, to be honest.
I don't know who's next, but let's see.
Let's see. That's going to define and shape the future of the brand.
It'll be very interesting, sort of like what's next in store, who is going to come after Jonathan Anderson and what that person is going to do. In the case of fashion brands, so much of it is in the heritage of the brand, and you need to tap into some of the brand codes. And then there's a question of like how much creativity does the creative director actually get within the fashion brand.
True.
So in your opinion, what makes a brand cult as opposed to just cool?
I don't think cult and cool are necessarily two different things. They can be the same. But I think if you're truly a cult brand, you have created more than just something iconic. You've created a community and you're serving that community. You truly understand yourself. And I think you're giving that community an identity as well. Or you create an identity for yourself that your community can believe in and follow. And I think that's the big difference between cult brands and regular brands. So if you look at brands like Nike, Apple, they're all struggling at the moment because there's so much happening in our media landscape that you tend to forget what you need to do to really fuel that community and help it thrive. So yeah, I think that's how we talk about it.
In an example with Nike, it was very interesting when they did their collab with Skims, because I think that was their way of pausing and reflecting and sort of understanding that we're starting to lose market share to players like Lululemon, Ala Yoga, like all these different, like Gymshark, all these brands that you mentioned are doing that right. Like they are tapping into communities, serving those communities and know who they are as a brand and is communicating that, and that's where they're taking all the market share. And Nike going for a collab with Skims is a way of trying to position themselves as a brand with a voice once again.
Yeah. It's all about focus and not forgetting who you really are and serving that.
So let's say if you're working with an early stage brand, not a lot of money, tiny budget, but they have big ambitions. What would be your advice to them, and like how could they even begin approach creativity?
I think the most important question you need to ask yourself is, how are you different? And if you don't know, and a lot of times you don't, because your product is more or less the same, or your service is more or less the same, then you need to create that difference. We've built an agency brand on that. We always say, when the world zigs, you need to zag. And I think that applies to brands as well. How are you different? Then you apply that and you really drive that.
How do you balance business goals with taking creative risks?
I think the biggest risk is to not take risks at all. If you're playing it safe, and if we always say, if nobody notices, the biggest risk is if nobody notices what you're doing.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with taking risks, and you're going to fail and you're going to make mistakes as you go. That's natural, but the reward is so much bigger. So I think risk is key, absolutely key. You have to take risks.
If there is a founder out there who's thinking, should I do this creative or should I do that creative, and it seems a little bit like it might ruffle feathers, your advice is just go for it and ask for forgiveness later.
Every campaign that I have done in my past that was successful had an element of risk. And all the campaigns that were average or unnoticed were discussed to death, were watered down. And the stuff that truly worked always had an element of risk. And very rarely was it so detrimental that we couldn't recover, or with the right PR strategy, etc., smoothen things out. There was never actually a real danger, just a perceived risk. But the risky stuff was always the successful stuff, without a doubt.
Do you have examples you can share with us of campaigns that have really worked, maybe where you put a bit more risk, and what was your thinking behind that?
Tons. The most recent one was for Heineken, where we put beer in shoes, and you could talk about risk there. Like, it's a product you consume, it's food, and you're walking on it, right? And you could say it's disrespectful or whatever, but I think we did it in a way that tapped into sneaker culture. So the fact that it was just beer in the shoe was just one part of the storytelling and part of the PR hook, but ultimately it was tapping into culture and making the brand cool to a younger audience. We called them the Heineken Kicks, and did them with someone in the sneaker community. He's the shoe surgeon. And that allowed the brand to go beyond advertising and truly speak to their audience, a younger audience, a new audience in that sense, on a whole nother level. Again, fueling cult versus just doing advertising.
No, it's very interesting. I actually read about that campaign. It's such a creative approach to how you position a brand that arguably is a heritage brand. You've seen your dad, your uncles drink Heineken, and now you're of drinking age, and you're like, what is my drink of choice? How do you make Heineken cool for the new young generation? I think it's a very cool and interesting approach.
Yeah, and it worked. All the numbers, we were tracking sentiment amongst Gen Z, and all the numbers went up. It was for a new type of Heineken Silver. It was the most successful launch in the company's history. Like you said, they're pretty old, or distinguished. And so, yeah, it proved it worked. And thankfully, there were key people at Heineken that understood the value of taking risks. And yeah, here we are.
Oh, that's amazing. What is one mindset shift you feel early stage brands need around creative?
I think a lot comes down to trust. Finding someone that, if you're not creative yourself, so if you don't have a creative director, or you're really a business-minded person, you need to find a partner that can help you with the creative, and then you need to allow it. A key element is trust, finding someone that can help you be creative and apply creativity to all those aspects we talked about earlier, and then let that person or those partners do their job.
It's a very interesting answer. Trust is what really makes or breaks that relationship. I think extends not just for working with creatives in particular, but across any sort of agencies, right? If you have an performance marketing agency who's doing your ads, or an influencer agency helping you source influencers for your campaigns, trust is a lot of times that like key element that you start questioning, like, oh, is this the best approach? Or, oh, like I could have done this better. Like, oh, I'm paying you all this money, like, no. But I think if you can develop that relationship, then it can be the difference between having a successful partnership and not.
Yes. Yeah, because ultimately we're all experts, right? I mean, you don't walk into a restaurant and then you walk into the kitchen and you want to talk to the chef about how that person makes the dish. You don't meddle around with it. You just accept where you go, and you can choose which restaurant you go to. You can go to the cheap ones, the good ones, like the one with reputation. That's the choice you have. But then ultimately you let the chef do their thing. So it's so weird that in other industries that's not always the case. And we hide it under, it's a collaboration, et cetera, but ultimately you need to let the experts do their job. Allow an element of risk by just trusting their expertise. That then leads to success.
How can brands identify which trends they should tap onto without looking like performative, to make sure that the creative sits well with the brand's identity?
I think we need to unpack maybe trends first, because I think there is the long-term trends and then there's the short-term stuff. And I think it always pays to look at the long-term stuff versus the short-term. I think if you're jumping on a short-term trend, you're already too late, because nowadays they're so fast. By the time you've developed something, it's usually too late, and then you look performative. But if you look at the more long-term trends, if you look at how society is changing, at what's really kind of like what people are concerned about or talking about, and if you play into that and you find your insights there, you're gonna find gold. And that's where I think those are the trends you should need to look at. Don't live day by day. Look at TikTok and see what people are doing today. Some brands are successful by just creating content. I don't think you're necessarily building a brand doing that. If you truly want to build a sustainable brand, you need to look at what really matters. And those things, they don't change very often, or they don't change fast. And that requires you to just really get deep into your audience and talk to them, understand them, and then you find a role or something you can do as a brand to kind of attach yourself there. And yeah, I think that's the way to do it.
Do you have any examples of these long-term trends that you have noticed lately that brands can take advantage of?
Yeah, I think currently we're talking a lot about younger audiences, right? Every brand is trying to figure out how to talk to them because their media consumption, et cetera, is different. And no one truly talks to them and understands them. And, everyone has a playbook, everyone has some research, everyone has the tropes, but no one truly understands them or talks to them. Most brands don't really want to. And I think that's a misunderstood audience, because I don't know, there's a lot of nuance in what is liked and how they're talking. And so trying to be truly relevant to them requires more than just, books of research. And it just, it's I don't know, it's an unspoken culture, an unspoken behavior. Other trends are, a trend we're going to face very soon is aging societies all around the world. I don't think any brands, so the total opposite. I don't think any brands are really equipped or thinking about how they can be relevant to those kinds of audience. And I think that's two examples of larger trends.
No, it's very interesting you mentioned the aging society, because I recently attended a panel and the managing partner for 500 Global talked about how one of the pillars they look at is longevity. One of the long-term trends is that we're starting to live longer, but the aging population isn't necessarily addressed or targeted by many brands. We don't really know what the longer lifespan brings in terms of the societal changes. If we have an aging population, who takes care of them? People have less kids, so now you have an issue where you have like one person who looks after potentially 4 grandparents. And yeah, it's very interesting. Larger trend, I guess you could say, to look into.
Yeah, and that's about relevance, right? Like we talked about those insights earlier. If you find them, you're more than just communicating. You're seeing your brand more holistically, and you find a new role. You can then apply creativity to your product, what you do, maybe change it, adjust it. That affects distribution, where and how you find that audience and talk to them, and where you're relevant, in what point. So we're moving away from just communication, right? Which is what we're currently doing, the playbooks. This audience likes this, and then we're talking this way, or we're doing a TikTok or something superficial.
Yeah, like make this TikTok and post this many times a day, and then
correct.
then it will work.
Yeah,
but you're like, well, have you actually gone and spoken to your audience? Go and talk to people, and then you can actually do something that works.
You're creating awareness, yes, by being there, but awareness is not everything. That's not how you're building a brand. We talked about cult brands earlier, right? You're a lot more than just there. You have a much bigger role. I think that's what you need to look into if you want to build a successful brand.
And what's one trend that you are tired of seeing in branding or creativity?
I think it's media agencies trying to tell us how to tell stories. And funny enough, that keeps changing. From their perspective, that keeps changing every 3 months, it feels like, as well. But I think there's no formula to how to tell a story. And everyone's trying to tell you there is. And I think that I'm really tired of.
I can feel that one. The second Skin project, where you turned an employee handbook into almost like a wearable art. What does that say about BBH Singapore's culture and your personal philosophy on creativity and internal creativity?
Second Skin is a handbook turned into a story experience. So it's a raincoat because it rains a lot here in Singapore, but that's not why we did it. But it's a story experience. So you're learning about our culture by looking at the garment, wearing it. There's a care label that talks about our wellness and mental health things. If you're broke, you just pull out the pocket and you find out how to do your expenses, etc., etc. Our values are embroidered next to the heart. There's a notebook, etc., etc. So there's a point to everything. And the reason we approached it this way is, why we have it in the first place, is culture, to really drive culture. And when we came out of the pandemic and we had a lot of onboarding done virtually, we really felt like we need to continue fueling our culture and telling the story of our culture. And so how are we different? What's our difference? And so the brief was, don't make a handbook, but don't make it a handbook. So what can we do? What is something that humbles you on your first day when you receive it and you feel like, oh, wow, okay, I'm in a very different place here, and a place that values creativity and just sees things differently. And that's how we ended up with doing a jacket versus just another handbook. So it's lived culture versus explained culture.
I love your approach of how do we make it special, and how do we make someone who maybe was onboarded virtually and was working from home, how do we make them feel included and feel special? It's very nice that you think that way.
Yeah.
So you've worked across many different industries, like everything from beauty to gaming to tourism. Is there one industry where you love working the most? And what in that industry makes creativity more rewarding?
I think I've had some of my most fun campaigns that I've done on the weirdest brands. So I think if you, again, free your mind and you apply creativity everywhere, I think you're going to find success. I've done campaigns for spark plugs and car parts, and that was when I was more junior, and it's a brand nobody wanted to work on, and so the brief landed on my desk, and I just freed myself from the industry and I just applied creativity, and we did some of the quirkiest, weirdest things. So I think it doesn't really matter what you're selling or what you're doing. If you have that mindset of just bring difference and be creative, do things differently, think about how you can do anything just differently than everyone else, then you're going to have fun as a creative. You enjoy what you're doing, but you're also, for the brand, you're creating success. So it was hugely successful in that case.
It's not about a favorite industry, but about working with the right people.
Correct. I think that's more important. And it's funny, like we're working in the industry of making brands because brands are made up. I think what truly matters, because that's sometimes you see, there's like certain brands there in every market. Why is there some markets where the brand's really successful and why is there some markets it's not? Because it's the same brand. It should be successful everywhere, right? Well, it's because of the people that work for that brand in that market. It comes down to just a handful of people in a conference room making a brave decision. Again, taking risks. And if you think about it that way, if you're finding a true partner, those markets are the successful ones. And the ones that aren't, they approach it differently.
How do you navigate failure? And how has that evolved when you were a team player to now that you're a leader?
Yeah. I mean, with risk comes failure.
Yeah.
And I remember moments where I was sitting in the living room of a marketing director and we were trying to create a crisis plan, et cetera, and when you're thinking, oh my God, now we really messed up. And it turned out to be a massive success. Everyone was just nervous around it. That person is now in a global role and super successful, and he allowed us to be creative. There's always a risk of failure, but the rewards are always better. So I think it's just, if you're not taking a risk, if you're not failing, you're not learning. If you're not learning, you're not getting better. And I think you need to just kind of free yourself from that word failure and just look at it as experimentation. And through experimentation, you're figuring out what really works for you and what doesn't. And I think that's the process. And so if you're just looking at failure as like, okay, that's the stuff that doesn't work, versus, again, nothing in my career so far, looking what was ever so bad that there was no comeback. And the rewards were always greater. So constant experimentation, I think, is how you need to look at it. And that's where you're going to find the really interesting stuff, the stuff that really sets you apart.
Well, it really sounds like that's the key to creativity, is freeing yourself from the limitations of what you think might be a failure, and like almost limiting yourself from the fear of it and just going for it. That's how you can stretch your creative muscle. Yeah,
creativity is a process and there's no formula. And through that process, you're figuring out where to go and what to do. And that's not linear either.
Do you feel like creativity is something that you're born with? Like there are people who are just naturally creative and people who are just naturally not, and you're not and you'll never ever will be? Or is it something that you can develop over time?
I think so. I think we're all born as creative people. When we're young, we're doing two things: copying and being creative. We're figuring out who we are, building our personality, and then we unlearn it. And I think the people we call creative nowadays are the ones that didn't unlearn it and continued building on their natural drive to make things. The ones that call themselves not creative or I'm not creative, those are the people that have unlearned it. I do think we're all born creative. Creativity is everything. Everything is creation. We're creating things every day. The whole universe is a constant recreation or creation of stuff, right? Like, so creativity is everything. And therefore, we are all creative. So at BBH, we say not a creative department, but a creative company. So everyone is creative. We're all contributing. And so, yeah, I don't think you can pigeonhole it as like there's, creative people and there's not.
You're a creative person, you're creative function, you're not.
We're all creative. We're all creative. We can all be creative. We can apply it. Again, creativity is not, when it comes to branding, it's not the thing you just apply to an ad. You can apply it to everything.
Yeah, and I think it's so true when you say that we're all born creative. If you look at children, right, every child is creative. Every child is into art, into music, into dancing, into like whatever it is, right? Whatever is the avenue of expression the child chooses, because they're not hindered by like all these things. They're not hindered by fear. They're not hindered by maybe like societal expectations or like the rules of how you're supposed to behave yet. And that's where they are creative. So like they don't have that almost like the boundaries of failure around them. So you go and draw. It's like, oh, I don't know how to draw. If I were to start drawing, I don't know how to draw. But like I give, a marker to my like daughter and she just starts to jumble things. And I think that's interesting.
When it comes to drawing, it's a good example of how we've unlearned creativity. We're all drawing on the left side of our brain, which is the rational side. So when you're now picking up a pen and, you haven't drawn in ages, you think you're drawing a nose. So you're thinking about the nose and you think about the eye and you're thinking about the constructs that you have created over time of what an eye is, of what a nose is, et cetera, et cetera. Versus if you're freeing yourself of that, if you're drawing on the right side of your brain, you're not thinking logically. And that's what creatives call when they're in the flow. That's when they're on the right side of the brain. And then you're not looking at it as a nose anymore. You're just looking at it as a shade or a length, a line that is this long. And if you're doing that, suddenly, and you can do that exercise now. If we had some time, just within half an hour, I could teach you how to draw on the right side of your brain. And if you did a portrait of yourself, it would look very differently.
Wow. It's very interesting. So you think like there is actual like exercises you can do to like try and like move yourself from the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain instead of free yourself a bit more.
Totally.
Wow, it's very interesting. In one of the interviews you've done in the past, you mentioned how your son's Lego creations are one of your sources of inspiration. How do your personal experience shape your creative outlook, and how do you think other people can tap into their creative juices that may come from their personal experiences? One
thing I learned in my career is to demystify what creation really is. And in the beginning of my career, I always thought, like you talk about it, you talk about the white page and you're starting on a blank page and then you're creating something out of nothing. I don't think that's what creation is, or I don't think that anymore. I think creation is a combination of things that are already there. And, Picasso famously said, a good artist or a bad artist copy, a good artist steal, or something like that. No, I stole that quote in the wrong way. So I stole badly. But so creation ultimately is combining different things. So if you're feeding yourself with lots and lots of information, ultimately you're going to end up being creative because you're seeing connections and bringing two things together that previously didn't go together. No one has thought about bringing them together, and suddenly you're creating something new out of it. So you're not actually copying. I think that's what maybe meant when he talked about stealing. You're taking something, but then you're doing something to it, and it becomes something new. And I think that's also a lot of times the creative process. Our conscious brain operates, I think, at a frequency of like 2 or 20 megabits per second, something like that. So it's not a lot. While we've got like these nerves in our spinal system, and when the expression when you're thinking with your gut, that's because they are all thinking at the same time, and they're operating at manifold speed. So I think it's 400,000 gigabits. So much more than your conscious brain. So if you're just feeding your subconscious with lots and lots of information and you're letting your gut take over, and sometimes you need to, when people say you need to sleep on, you need to sleep on it, that's what happens. Your subconscious, those 400,000 gigabits are at work and are creating something new. So again, demystifying what creativity really is. And I think people that work in the creative industry have mastered that as a process. And obviously we've created pathways, etc. So what other people do in their sleep, we literally do in our sleep, but when we're awake. And so we've just trained this kind of thinking and this kind of process. So that's why we're like the experts versus everyone else. While we're all creative, if you do it as a professional, you've developed techniques and a trust in yourself, a trust into that process that if you keep feeding, and we're all naturally curious, so we keep feeding our subconscious so that we can make new things out of it.
Funny you mentioned the frequency of how quickly our rational brain works and the irrational, like the gut, works. Because I don't remember where I learned this, but they teach firefighters to listen to their instinct because they are obviously in the life-threatening situation so often, right? Like you're in a building that's about to collapse, you're saving somebody. And in those situations, you cannot rely on your rational brain because it's not fast enough. So you have to almost like act on your instinct because you've been through these situations enough, you've trained this muscle enough. So, maybe with the side of your eye, you've seen an escape route, or you've seen like, oh, there is a window that I can jump out of there. And that's interesting. Almost like you wouldn't think of firefighters as creative, but that's a way of, it's almost very similar to what you're describing, where you are trained to lean into that subconscious and your gut and your instinct. And that's a way for you to create your creative work, or for someone like a firefighter to like survive, but it's ultimately the same creative process.
Yeah, except that we're not saving anyone.
We're not saving anyone. We're here just trying to sell beer, but... So you mentioned the Heineken campaign.
Yeah.
Which I think is a very cool, almost you can call like a PR stunt. What, in your opinion, makes a good PR stunt something that really lands versus something that can seem a little bit gimmicky? And you're like,
yeah, I mean, fame for the sake of fame is when you're gimmicky. I think fame that is rooted in true relevance is a whole nother game. Is it relevant to culture as well as is it relevant to your brand? And if you are relevant to those two things, then you're doing the right thing. You can scream and be loud and people will listen and might talk about you for a day or two. But if you hit on a nerve, if you hit on a cultural nerve, then it lasts.
That's very interesting. In order to execute a good PR stunt, you have to understand the culture, which means it again goes back to community and it goes back to your customer, knowing them, like understanding what is culture for them. Because I think culture is also such a big word, right? One of the trending words now, like everybody talks about culture, like how do we tap into culture? But I feel like it's what defines very small little communities. And if you understand the culture of your customer, well, that's your culture. You don't have to go tapping into the big trends on TikTok or find like what's the coolest thing the kids are doing these days. But whatever is your customer, like if you understand them and their culture, like that could be.
And then you're making a real connection other than you're just getting noticed. The difference between awareness, people have seen you, versus people like you, understand you, feel like we're the same, etc., etc. And so when we talk about tapping into culture, what a lot of brands also get wrong is they think about groups that are way too large, and then you're again not talking to anyone. If you're trying to talk to everyone, you're not talking to anyone. And so, in the case of Heineken Kicks, we looked at somewhat of a niche audience, sneakerheads. Not everyone. Yes, it's growing, etc., etc. But we looked at a relatively niche audience, and we made a true, unique connection, and we were truly relevant to them in that moment, which then had a spillover effect to everyone else in culture. And so everyone was talking about it, even though there was just a certain limited amount of group that was truly connecting on another level. But that connection transcended just that group to a larger audience as well, which led to the success.
Yeah, because I think it was made in such an authentic way that allowed for it to transcend from this niche audience to a larger group. It didn't feel performative and felt much more real. So building on this, if a founder is looking for creating a splashy PR moment, what do you feel like is the single most important thing they need to get right?
I think it's everything that we talked about, right? Like it's about difference. It's about taking risks. It's about doing it with the right partner and being relevant, tapping into a true insight, or really understand who you're selling to or who you want to make a connection. Maybe it's a better question. Who do you really want to make a connection with? And that's where you start. And then everything else develops from there.
All goes back to know your customer, know your audience, know what they like, understand their culture, understand their language, understand what they relate to, and then find the right people to execute with, and off to the races you go.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about AI, but I kind of want to talk about it. So everyone's talking about AI, artificial intelligence. What's your take on it? Like, what's exciting and what's a threat?
Yeah, I mean, a threat. Will AI kill a lot of the jobs we have right now? Yes. But can it truly replace the creative mind? Absolutely no, without a doubt. If you think about it, AI is built on all the information that is there, broadly speaking. So what it does is it gives you the most probable outcome based on that information. And today we talked a lot about difference, originality. So I think the one thing AI won't be able to give you is that be truly different, original. It's going to give you the most probable solution, which means it's going to be the most average solution because it's based on everything else there is. So by definition, the result is average versus truly unique. And I think that's where you need still human creativity to find something that is truly different, risky, and will stand out. So I think that's when it comes to our job and what we do, et cetera, et cetera. I do think AI is defining and is about to define the future of how we think about brands. So if you look at the history of brands, I think the role of brands has changed over time. At the very beginning, it was literally branding, and it was the role of the brand was just to give you trust. You know, like when industrialization started, et cetera, you didn't just buy your services from your neighbor and you knew that person, you could trust that person. You needed something else that gave you trust. You know, there was people that were selling snake oil and all that. And that's how brands started. They were a mark of trust. Over time, they developed and they started to give you identity, et cetera, something to believe in, et cetera, et cetera. And so the last decade or so, brands have changed again. They became more of an interface, and there's a lot of services around. We talked about Nike. There's a Nike running app, et cetera, right? There's more to a brand than just trust and identity, community, but also an interface. And I think the next phase can be driven to be seen by AI, where you can truly anticipate and understand your audience individually based on the data they're giving you. And I think it's for us to define now how AI is sort of creating a new role for brands, if you think about it that way. Well, I think a lot of things have to come together in terms of brands allowing creative people to be part of that process. How much can we truly collaborate in defining that and through experimentation figure out how that's going to come to life? I think is really in its very early stages, but really, really interesting space.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't think AI is ever going to replace a human mind and creativity in that way because, like you mentioned, like only a human can draw those connections from your subconscious. You've read a book, you've seen a video, you watched a movie, like you saw your kid playing, you watched something else, and then your brain does something and you connect those dots and that creates something new. I don't think AI can replace that. The way I see it is it's a tool for someone who can't draw or thinks they can't draw, or maybe I'm not an illustrator, I don't know how to go on Adobe Illustrator and make this thing I wanted to make, but now with AI, it allows me to at least make a draft and give it some sort of shape that I can test and iterate, and maybe that can enable more people to be creative from that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool like any other tool. And we've added tools to our toolbox, you know, not just recently, but, you know, since forever. When Photoshop came for the first time, so with digital photography, et cetera, et cetera. So all these tools completely transformed and shaped the industry the way it is now. And so, yes, AI as a new tool is changing that, shaping that as well. But I think if we're just looking at AI just as that, I think we're almost asking the wrong questions. I think, like, how else can we use it? And how is it actually not just changing how we use it as a tool, but how is it actually changing how we think about brands in the first place? I think that's when it gets really, really interesting.
How do you think the creative leadership will evolve in the next 5 to 10 years?
In our industry, creativity is receding on a large scale. I see a lot of efficiency, et cetera, come into play. And I think the people that will truly differentiate themselves and be successful are the ones that double down on it, allow it, with the right partners. It's about getting access to the right people to not just talk about communication, but apply creativity everywhere. I think those people that do that successfully, I think will be the ones that define creativity. And I'm starting to see that already. So there's a resurgence of creativity. It's on a decline overall, but I can see a resurgence by people who apply it in the way I just spoke about.
I hope creativity doesn't decline, you know.
But I think obviously I'm talking as someone, leading a creative agency, so I'm talking from that perspective.
Yeah.
I think creativity is applied. If you look at the young and up and coming brands, they're applying creativity already in their product, in how they talk about it, in how they sell it, etc., etc. And so, again, I think we're almost like coming to a full close, right? Creativity is everything.
Should we wrap up the episode with rapid fire round? I have some short answer questions prepared. I'll ask you a question and you give me like a 1 or 2 word answer to that. Let's see how we go with these ones. What's your go-to creativity unlock when you're stuck?
I think it's music. It gets me from my left brain to my right brain.
What's a creative risk you're glad you took?
I think every risk, every one of them, they all paid off.
Was not one you couldn't recover from, like you mentioned.
No.
The most overrated creative campaign of the last 5 years?
Oh, I don't think I can answer that question. I would piss off so many people.
The most underrated brand right now?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have one answer there. I think a lot of brands I think there's a lot of influencers that don't realize how much of a brand they really are. So I think there's certain influencers that are completely underrated and could be of more value.
What's a brand you would love to work on but haven't?
I think Lego. I'm a Lego addict.
Let's tag Lego in this episode. What's a small detail you obsess over in your creative work?
I'm a sucker for story structure, and I could talk to lengths about it, but in one sentence, it's story structure.
What was the last thing that made you stop scrolling and look?
I think it's some leaked images from a new Lego set that's coming out, a Lego Ninjago set that's going to come out in summer, and it's just incredible. Yeah.
Do you collect a lot of Legos, like those, like the big ones you can?
Yes. The official answer to my wife is no. It's an average amount, but it's yes, it's a lot.
It's funny. I know we're running out of time, but this was one of the big comeback things for Lego is when they started making those big sets for like targeting adults and
yes.
I'm
one of them.
The comeback.
I also rebought all the sets that I had as a child and then sold. I bought them on the secondhand market for way too much money. So I'm being smarter now. I'm buying them when they're in the store. That's forward thinking. It's an investment.
Should we do the fill in the blank? I will say a sentence and you fill in the blank. Okay. A great brand feels like?
A friend.
Good taste is?
Subjective.
I wish more brands would stop
telling creatives how to do their job.
The future of creativity is?
TBC. TBD, to be defined, right?
AI is?
Artificial.
In 5 years, great creative work will look like?
Something we will say wasn't possible 5 years ago.
The worst advice I keep hearing is?
There is a formula.
There is a playbook.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's it for the episode.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Sascha, for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.
If somebody wanted to follow your work, where is the best place to follow your work, get in touch with you?
So I work for BBH Singapore. You can just Google that. I'm on LinkedIn as well, or my website, thisguyprobablykostsalot.com.
I love that website. I'm obsessed with the homepage.
So there's a contact form there as well. Just reach out.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sascha, for joining me. It was great having you. Thank you.
Thank you.